Okay, so today we don't have, man, last time our last PowerPoint was massive and there was like a huge amount of notes. This one's a little bit better. We're not going to see quite as many notes today, not as many pages. But we are going to dive into, moving into our posture assessments. I know we've been talking a lot about this lately, which is, we're kind of re-exposing ourselves to this and getting more and more and more familiar with the overhead squat. And then we'll also continue with a little bit of posture talk on Monday as well, but we'll be moving into like pushing and pulling assessments, which is like upper body posture assessments. The thing about the overhead squat though is it really does almost get pretty much every compensation you're going to see. So I would say it's sort of our main assessment. At least I'm a little biased here because it's like my favorite thing to break down. I've found that knowing the overhead squat really, really well and being able to break it down is easy for me to communicate to new clients, which makes it very easy for me to, get those new clients signed up for training. You know what I mean? So I might be a little bit biased, and maybe it's not the world's best assessment, but I'm a huge fan of it. And today we're going to start breaking down. There's a lot to talk about. I mean, we did talk a little bit about it. We did sort of a brief general overview as we went through in person the other night, where we were like, okay, like this person moves this way, this is what this means, but none of it was like in note form and stuff. And we really do want to make sure that everybody is super familiar. So today we are starting what we're going to do for the rest of this class for the final sort of couple days of this class. We're going to break down these most common postural distortions in the second half. So once we get through the PowerPoint slides, which you can see there's not that many today. Once we get through the PowerPoint slides, what we're going to do is we are going to go into our overhead squat solutions table. And the second half of class, I say half, but the final part of class will be where we address each of these compensations. So, today it'll be foot turnout plus knees cave in, because these often really go together. It's not too common that you'll see one without the other, because when you fall with the foot and turn it out a little bit, that naturally makes the knees cave in. So those two are very associated. Then we'll get into an excessive lean, a low back arch, the arms falling, and then forward head and shoulder elevate. That's another one that usually comes together. So we'll be putting those together. So we got day 8, 9, 10, day 8, 9, 10, 11, and there's our final day there. So we'll be looking at all that dysfunction as we go through the final bits of this class. So what's that for now? Because I can come back to it later. So yeah, so again, we're coming back to this idea of posture. NASM does sometimes ask you textbook definition wise, like what's the definition of posture? So we did put the definition up here. It's the alignment and the function of all the components of your kinetic chain, right? It's all the muscles and the bones and the nervous system that's controlling it. It's determining like how all of that is able to sort of move you around. And so we need, when we talk about posture, it allows us to have what we call neuromuscular efficiency. A neuromuscular efficiency is basically like a fancy way of saying, hey, you're recruiting the right muscle and you're doing it at the right time and you're doing it for the right amount of force, and the muscle is recruiting in the right plane of motion, the way it's supposed to, so for instance, like my lat, which we know does a lot of things, right? The lat can really move in all three planes, right? It can go sagittal, it can go, oh my God, transverse, and then it can also go frontal, right, to the side. So it can do all three of those actions, which means it's really common to get overactive. Our lats often really like to tighten up, especially like, a lot of guys who do a lot of like pull-ups and things like that. I in fact, actually like friggin' Edwin, I think you'll appreciate this, but like I haven't met somebody like in the military in forever that doesn't have overactive lat muscles, because everybody's practicing friggin' chin-ups all day long. but yeah, so that's a really common overactive muscle there. And so neuromuscular efficiency requires proper posture. We need to be able to like be flexible with that lat so that it can, relax into a full range of motion as well as contract into a full range of motion. And we can't do that if it's tight, so that all kind of comes together when we're talking about like posture. We are talking about like these ideal length tension relationships, right? This is kind of what we were drawing on the whiteboard. But if we look at like a length tension relationship, right? If we zoom out and we just look at like an overactive versus an underactive muscle, zoomed out, it kind of looks like this, this is kind of like how the posture is being sort of like drawn in the directions it's really not supposed to, right? Like this muscle's pulling too much and this muscle's not pulling enough. But on a cellular level, right, when we look at like a length tension relationship, we can see here in an underactive muscle, there's just not very much overlap of actin and myosin proteins. Whereas like in an overactive muscle, there's too much overlap of actin and myosin proteins. And then right here, this is like ideal, right? This is sort of our optimal length tension relationship. So I wish that I had a nice enough like, editing software like for graphics and stuff. I would totally just like copy this and like put the overactive one, really short, like pulling on pulling on the joint like this, and then the underactive one, I'd make it like really long and it would be just like pulling like this. So that is this is kind of what we're looking at in this overactive underactive situation here. And it's altering our posture. I mean, like here's here's kind of an interesting look at this. If we look at like, let's just say the anterior pelvic tilt muscles, take a look at these two postural distortions that are kind of opposites of each other, right? You can see here on the left-hand side, this is an anteriorly tilted pelvis. And the reason that's happening is because the muscles that are grabbing the front of the spine here and then grabbing the front of the pelvis here, they're pulling down, right? They're pulling down on the hip. And so that's causing, if you look at the pelvis on the side, right, that's causing it to sort of be pulled this way. And then meanwhile, the erector spinae, the lats, all those muscles that are kind of coming down to the top part here, they're pulling upwards. And so this is creating this tilting action. If we want to get it to tilt back the other way, we need to loosen up this overactive side and tighten up the underactive side. So we're going to loosen up the overactive side by addressing that through like things like foam rolling and through things like static stretches, or even PNF stretches are a really good option. Those are sort of that assisted stretch. You guys may have done PNF if you've ever had somebody do that, thing where they're stretching you out and they're like, contract against me, and you kind of squeeze and then you actively relax afterwards. Versus our other muscles, like our muscles that we need to strengthen, flip to the other side of the joint, the underactive stuff, we got to get that turned on. Right. So we're going to do some exercises for the abdominals here. That's going to pull up this way. And we're going to strengthen the glutes, and we're going to strengthen the hamstrings. And that's going to pull back down this way. So this is almost like an overactive, underactive muscles list here. So that is sort of the general concept here of really what our entire job is, and like I said, like this is stuff that I love to break down for my clients, because it's just like one of those things where they go, wow, like, that means that you really did pick my exercise routine, like you designed it specifically to me, which I super appreciate. It's like, great, that's what we're going for. So posture requires a proper length tension relationship, and we can restore that length tension relationship, like I said, by relaxing the tight muscles and strengthening the weak muscles. So if you have altered length tension relationships, you're obviously going to have altered control. And when we have that altered control, we're going to see what we call them our postural distortions, but they are the predictable patterns of muscle imbalance. Predictable patterns of muscle imbalance are basically how NASM has taken this, that table that I pulled up earlier, where it's just like, these are the very predictable patterns of imbalance, the things that we'll commonly see: the feet turn out, the knees cave in, the excessive lean, the arching, the arms falling forward, the forward head, and the shoulder elevation. Now, those are the only ones you guys have to worry about in this course and in the core. But every now and then I'll mention the ones that you'll get when you get to capstone, which are these muscles, right? You can see the table's a little bit bigger, right? It goes from, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rows to 2, 9, 10, 11, 12 rows. So it's a substantial growth. But that being said, most of that is because we are adding this posterior view here. And it really does kind of mean some of the same stuff. So instead of just the feet turn out, there's some other very common postural distortions we're going to see. We're going to see the feet turn out. We're going to see the knees cave in, but every now and then we'll see the knees cave out. It's not super common. I don't run into knee cave outers that often, but it does happen. So we see that knee varus. You'll see people who kind of have that bow-legged posture, right? That's a little bit too much, actually. Like, I like a good external rotation, but like that knee is not really in alignment there. Too much varus, right? And so like that's just to kind of see the knees cave out. You'll often spot a knees cave out person. I thought I saw a picture of it there. You'll often spot it they'll be on instead of the inside ridge of their foot, they'll be on the outside ridge of their foot. And so that causes that sort of bow-legged posture. Trying to find just like a static picture of a person, but a little more zoomed out. Yeah, there we go. You can kind of see it there, right? So you can see like this is obviously somebody's thumbnail for like a video that they're making, but yeah, they put a lot of their weight on that outside ridge, and it causes this bowing. It is not as common, and it's also a lot more subtle, so it's a little harder to spot, but we'll see it every now and then. And then we see the excessive lean, we see the low back arch, we see the low back rounds as well. This one is called the butt link. I like to call it old man butt. What the? I don't know what all that artwork is, but you see people who they squat kind of like this, right? They get that like really intense kind of rounding action. Now, this is because he's going super, super low. In fact, this guy right here is one of the best squatters out there. But like he's going super low, which is causing that. Some rounding is to be expected. But when it's really severe, you see stuff like this, right? And that is exactly the opposite of a really intense low back arch. The low back arch was the hip flexors pulling too hard. This is the hamstrings pulling too hard, right? They're grabbing back, they're coming from here and they're running up and they're just pulling the pelvis down in the back. Meanwhile, the abdominals are actually pulling the pelvis down, up in the front, because your abdominals, your rectus abdominis in particular, it runs onto your pelvis. It goes all the way up to your sternum. So basically, like you can see, this guy's pelvis is being pulled up to his sternum because his abs are tightening. His abs are contracting rather than, yeah, there we go. His abs are contracting rather than just stabilizing, right? So that's the sign of a weak core stabilization system. And you'll see here, it's like muscles they need to work on. That's all their core stabilizers there. Arms fall forward, forward head, shoulder elevation. Then we got feet flattening, which is basically the same as feet turnout. There's a lot of like really big similarities here. It's just the feet flattening is that excessive eversion. We see a lot more of the sort of everted foot movement, right? Now, oftentimes this is accompanied with the external like foot rotation, but it's a lot easier to spot from the back, which is why we do actually like a posterior view, because you can actually even see there's the kind of lines coming in there. There we go. That's pretty good, right? Like that's kind of, this is a good picture of like, you can see the flattening there versus like ideally like kind of being in alignment. And so, That's another one. And then heels rising, right? Heels rising is one that we talked about. That one's actually really simple. Hey Dion, we were talking about this a little bit, right? With the foot turn out, knees cave in thing, and then the heel rise, right? This is one that's in this ES. It's actually really simple though. It's a tight soleus and a weak anterior tib. 2 muscles, you know. So there's a little bonus. We're going to pay attention to those, but we're going to cover those with the foot turnout anyways, minus the anterior tib part. So, you know, it's kind of covered anyways. But you will see that kind of. There's going to be like intense pictures of people doing this, but I'm trying to. Hopefully, there's like a. Yeah, it's like these are ones where people are kind of doing it on purpose, but but yeah, you'll see people's like heels every now and then. They'll pop up off the ground while they're squatting. I guess you can see it. You can see it here in that one. Just pay attention to the back of the foot. I like to watch the shoes and just see if the shoes decompress. And if you can see like the foam sort of relax in their heel, it's like and then there's the asymmetric weight shift. David, this is what we were talking about. This one's kind of a pain in the butt. This one's tough because you have to basically solve the problem twice. You've got a knees cave out situation on one leg, and you got a knees cave in situation on the opposite leg. So you can see we're going to work on the adductors and the TFL on the same side as the shift, but then we're going to work on the piriformis, hamstrings, and glutes on the opposite side. And then we just flip that, right? Adductors, and that was the same side. So now we need to strengthen the adductors on the opposite side. And then we need to strengthen all those extensor muscles on the same side. So that's the asymmetric weight shift, or sometimes you'll see like the hip hike, which is really an example of a asymmetric shift. Actually, that's great. So you can see here, it's like he's got a bit of a scoliosis, right? So that is sort of our big approach to everything that we're going to be going over. Like I said, over the next 6 days, those are the predictable patterns of muscle imbalance. Are there other ones out there? Totally, yeah, absolutely. But those are definitely the ones that we sort of cover the most with our assessments and stuff. And so what we're seeing is that a client has like I said, a muscle imbalance, right? It's and what that is by sort of definition is it's alterations of the length of a muscle that surrounds a particular joint. So this comes from, just static poor posture. If somebody is just consistently not engaging their core, kind of letting their posture kind of round around. I know that I have that habit. Like a lot of times, like I'll be doing something, I'll get really wrapped up in something, and like it's the reason, like I told you guys, like the forward head posture, that's one that like practically everybody freaking has at this point. It's kind of like human nature to get kind of sucked into things, last night, I got super excited. I don't know if anybody else is as excited as I am about the new Ghostbusters movie. Ghostbusters is like my 3rd favorite film ever. It's like Star Wars, Back to the Future, Ghostbusters, and a lot of people are like, oh, I can't name my favorite. I know what my favorites are. I love that movie, and so I'm super stoked about the new one because I think it looks really cool. I love the idea that it's like a younger generation. I think it's fun. And they dropped a new trailer last night, and I watched it like 5 times, and I noticed that like halfway through it I was like, that's just like completely leaned in, and I was like, oh man, I got like bad turtleneck right now. And that was definitely something that I think I think it's human nature in a way, and why that's such a common one. But we see that just poor posture. We see repetitive movements. That's a big one. The more often you are doing a movement, the more likely you are to develop overactivity in the muscles that do that movement. And then sometimes it can just be like a lack of movement, like getting stiff because you are sort of stuck in one position. There's a really Has anybody in here, little class survey real quick, did anybody have to read The Jungle when they were in school?
No.
So
What's the book about the meat factory, right? Where they do like all that crazy stuff.
it is the book about the meat factory, yes.
Yeah, where they do I remember that they did that one time where like they would pat down the meat because sometimes there's some dirty stuff in there, man. Well, back in the day, you know, that's the reason why a lot of people don't know that that book was one of the key reasons why we have a food inspection that we have today.
He's right. That is very true. It is the reason FDR read that book and then decided to make the FDA.
Yeah.
David, you're nailing it today.
Yeah. Yeah. And
so
then I remember there was sorry to cut you off.
No, you're good.
Okay. The one I remember the most from the book is that they described that they would grab meat, and the guy writing the book, I can't remember his name, but from his perspective, he said that the meat smelled terrible and that they would use soda, like club soda, and they would pat down the meat to not make it smell as bad.
Yes.
You know, just some gross stuff like that.
So one of the things in The Jungle, right? There and it's all about like this it's about a meat packing factory that, like, you know, there were no rules on like how it was meant to be kept or anything, and so it got like really nasty. But one of the things they talk about in the book that I remember like kind of standing out to me was, you know, and I wish that we had a picture of it. Oh man, yeah, I can't find a photo of people doing it, but it was where, you know, they had these, you know, cows would come into this big, like these cattle would come into this thing, and, you know, the butchers would be like above them, and they would have this like metal prong thing that they would use to basically take out every cow. And so they'd be like, you know, whack, and they move on to the next one, whack, whack, and they would like kind of just down the road, but they did it in the rafters of this like barn like thing that they were doing. And so they would walk like this through the rafters, like while they were doing it. They would like reach down below them so that they wouldn't be like, you know, cattle, which, you know, if they cause like a stampede or something, it wouldn't get hurt. So they were protected on the rafters. But because they would do that, I don't know what, 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, like whatever they were working, they started getting the nickname, and I think it was they called them like the Gorilla Men, or you know, they called like, there was like it looked like they were hunched over, and their posture would just get stuck that way because they would do it hours and hours and hours and hours at a time. And it was like there was like a whole section. I remember being like horrified when I was reading that. I was like, oh my gosh, can you imagine like doing something so often that your posture, like your entire body sort of like changes and gets stuck in one position, and then you have like a lack of mobility, a lack of ability to move and stuff. You know, that was like, I was like, man, that really like bothered me. I mean, the book was disgusting in general, but like, and had a lot of like horrifying stories in it. But as a kid, as a high schooler, I remember being like particularly bothered by that idea. So we definitely see, you know, the more often you do stuff, and it has like, you know, very physical changes. A lot of times we think of this as, you know, the muscles, right? But this actually does have an effect on our bones as well. There's a principle called Wolff, I think it's double F, Wolff's Law, which is basically going to state that soft tissue and hard tissue will adapt to whatever stress you place on it, right? So like your body will naturally adapt to whatever type of stress you place on it. So when you, you know, exercise regularly, it increases the density of your bones, right? But when you also like break a bone, well, then your body is going to put extra, this is a weird article, it's going to put extra calcium like in those areas to sort of repair it, but it will repair along the section where that was, you know, sort of like needed and stuff, right? And so you can see like this just creates a much more dense bone there, right? So Wolff's Law is all about that. Now, if you were to also just like consistently move a bone the same way and create the same type of fractures and the same type of thing, you're going to get a lot of density in those areas. And that can sometimes mean that like that muscle won't be able to move that bone through its like range of motion anymore, because the joint is going to be, you know, altered in terms of its overall length and stuff. It's really interesting. They look at like UFC fighters and stuff, and they will notice like the bone density in their shin bones are denser than the average person's. And the same thing in like soccer players in their knees, and also I think UFC fighters in their knees. And then we see rugby players, right? They get in that thing called the scrum. They have more bone density in their shoulders, and that's great. Because bone density means that, you know, we're less likely to fracture something. But if it starts altering our posture, that can have really negative effects. Or if you spend all day sitting in a computer chair rounding your shoulders over, right, your spinal discs get used to being in what we call kyphosis. And kyphosis is that sort of hunchback posture at the top, right? And we'll start to see that very commonly as we get older. You know, they say like I remember when I was a kid, my mom was 5'10". She's like 5'8" now. You know, I always remembered that because I remember like when I was like 5'10" myself, and I was like, you know, taller than my mom for the first time. And then the same thing to my dad eventually. So yeah, so those are sort of our common postural distortions, and those are the problems that they cause, right? So the three that are most common when it comes to static posture, first one's going to be called pronation distortion syndrome. We've talked about this a lot, but this is where, you know, when we look at a muscle imbalance, right, and we have these altered length of the muscles, we have an overactive muscle on one side that is in a shortened or contracted state. So for instance, if a client's knees are caving in, the adductor muscles, which do the adduction, they pull the knees in towards the middle, are in a shortened state. So they're used to kind of squeezing this way, so they won't really let go. And then we have underactive muscles. Underactive muscles are muscles that are in a lengthened or relaxed state. So if this is being adducted, then if we have to go up to the top, that's where we see the abduction muscles are weakened, right? They are not pulling. If a client exhibits knees cave in, the glutes, which are responsible for abduction, are in a lengthened state. So now the adductors are shortened and the abductors are lengthened, and boom, there's our muscle imbalance, right? And then we also have what's happening here is where we're seeing two sort of principles kind of play out here, right? So one of them is what's called altered reciprocal inhibition. Now, this term right here, guys, this is probably one of our key terms. We pull it up in class a lot, but this is definitely a term that you want to keep your eyes on and get this memorized. So really quickly, let's before we talk about what altered reciprocal inhibition is, let's review what reciprocal inhibition is. So reciprocal inhibition is when one muscle contracts, the antagonist muscle is supposed to relax, right? Like all of your muscles have this agonist-antagonist relationship. So when I squeeze my bicep, my tricep is supposed to relax. When I squeeze my tricep, my bicep is supposed to relax. When I squeeze my chest, my upper back is supposed to relax. When I, you know, squeeze my upper back, my chest is supposed to relax. Like that's what's supposed to happen. And that's how our nervous system is sort of like arranged. And that is what reciprocal inhibition, when one muscle contracts, the antagonist is supposed to relax. We actually use reciprocal inhibition. You guys might recognize this. David, Dion, and Thomas, you guys will recognize this from our program design classes, right? Like we actually use reciprocal inhibition as a tool where we are trying to get our clients to relax one of their muscles. And what we do, the way we do that is we just basically contract the other muscle as often as we can, right? So like if I'm trying to get my hip flexors to relax, if I contract my glutes, which is the exact antagonist to my hip flexors, ideally that muscle will let go, right? And that's sort of the approach here, right? That's where we use reciprocal inhibition. We do that in what we call active isolated stretches. So for instance, like, let's say I'm trying to stretch out my hamstrings. I think it's kind of the best example, right? If I'm trying to stretch out my hamstring and I want to get this thing down here to loosen up, I'm going to contract the antagonist, which is my glute. So I'm just going to take my hand back here and I'm just going to go and hopefully maintain my freaking balance. I'm going to squeeze that and then I'm going to relax. And I'm going to squeeze that and then I'm going to relax. And I'm going to squeeze it, right? So I'm contracting my quads, telling my hamstring to relax. So I'm using reciprocal inhibition as a tool to kind of relax one of my muscles there, right? But when that muscle doesn't relax, like what happens if we contract the agonist and then the antagonist doesn't let go? We end up with what we call altered reciprocal inhibition, which is where an overactive agonist decreases the neural drive of its functional antagonist. Okay, so the opposite muscle on the other side of the joint refuses to let go. And that causes weakness, that causes underactivity, because your nervous system has a really hard time getting that muscle to kind of pull against its opposite direction. And so that's what's happening here, right? The muscles that are, the overactive adductor muscles are reciprocally inhibiting the gluteus maximus muscles, or gluteus medius muscles. Same thing is true of the lower cross syndrome, which is that anterior pelvic tilt I mentioned earlier that we practiced the other day. And the same thing is true of that upper cross syndrome, the rounded shoulders, internally rotated shoulders, forward head posture that we also kind of covered the other day there, right? Again, we got muscles that are really tight up here in the posterior side and down here in the anterior side. And we got weakened muscles down here on the posterior side and up here on the anterior side. So we need to strengthen certain ones and stretch the others. This is why so many people, like, they work on their posture all day. They're like, I do everything I'm supposed to. I'm like, I stretch and I stretch and I stretch and I stretch. I'm just not getting more flexible. And it's like, well, you're addressing one side of the problem. You're not addressing both sides of the problem. You are turning off the overactive muscle, which is great, but you're not pulling the bone back into alignment by strengthening the underactive muscles. And this is why, like, I'm sure a lot of us probably skip our warm-ups and cool downs every now and then. I think that is sort of pretty common amongst a lot of people. But you'll see people who, even though they don't spend a lot of time stretching and stuff, they're very, very flexible. That's because strengthening can also kind of draw you through those full ranges of motion and help with your mobility. So those are sort of our three most common static postures. I know we talked about those just the other day, but now we also need to look at our dynamic postures. Dynamic postures are posture assessments where you actually make someone move through a range of motion. So static means to stay put, dynamic means to move. So a dynamic posture assessment is a posture assessment that gauges someone as they are moving through a range. So these are posture assessments that relate to the functions such as squatting, pushing, pulling, or balancing, and they put specific types of stress on the kinetic chain. So the big one that we always talk about, my favorite, is the overhead squat. It's a posture assessment that's designed to assess dynamic flexibility, so flexibility under movement, and an integrated total body strength, like ideally the correct muscles firing when they're supposed to. So you're going to have your client stand with their feet shoulder width apart and their toes pointed straight ahead. Now, I know it's a squatting action, and here's the thing, like, if we look up proper barbell squat form, we're going to see a lot of really good pictures of people with externally rotated feet slightly, right? I see a lot of stuff like this, right? That's actually great. I actually prefer a little bit of an external rotation on that barbell squat. I'm going to show you guys a little video about that today because it's a little bit of a faster lecture, but show you a fun video about how to kind of assess that rotation and what your stance width and what your rotation should be. But that'll be sort of a bonus at the end. But in the overhead squat, we are purposefully doing it with toes pointed straight forward. Because under a body weight situation, they should be able to move through that range of motion. We notice that their feet really want to turn out. That's going to be a big one. We want to make sure that the shoes are off while we're doing this, by the way. Not only does that make it easier for us to see, but a lot of shoes, a lot of modern running shoes, a lot of modern like athletic shoes and stuff, they have a substantial amount of padding on the heel and a little bit less in the ball of the foot. And that puts us into plantar flexion. You can see there's a lot of excessive, I mean, that some of this is also coming up over the ridge. The foot does go down lower than that, but we do see like a lot of this extra kind of padding on the heels. Oh man, that's not great. Which the theory behind that, by the way, there's sort of a whole history as to how this got started, and nobody really knows for sure like how our freaking shoes got this way. But a lot of credit goes to Nike, actually. This guy named Bill Bowerman. He's the one who invented the very first pair of like Nikes, and he did it in his kitchen using like certain types of like latex foam and a waffle iron. And that's how he created, he was like a coach at Eugene, Oregon's Oregon State University. And so like he he literally created like the first pair of Nike shoes. If we look up like Bill Bowerman, he was a very, very famous coach, and he created I think they were called was it the Nimbus? And at first they didn't have like that much padding. Like their original track shoes didn't. And so Bowerman sort of was like, man, we need more and more and more padding. He's like, he had a theory that if you could just take a bigger step, if you could extend your stride a little bit longer and land on your heel, and still take the same number of steps in a race, you would finish that race faster. And so he wanted it, but he found that when you extended that length, people were slamming their heel into the ground, and so it was kind of painful. And so he decided to create a shoe that had some padding on the heel, and they kind of took off from there. But the problem is, by doing that, you're changing your running form you have like this thousands and thousands of years of evolutionary biology that was not designed to keep up with this running form, which is why a lot of people think that you shouldn't run on, heel to toe. You should be running like, on your foot should land pretty much flat when you're running. And I could do a whole talk on that. If you ever want to read more about it and understand more about it, read this book called Born to Run by Christopher McDougall. This is actually my favorite nonfiction book. I think that this book is absolutely incredible. It's been out for a couple of years now, but it's all about, you can even see here, if you look at the way that this guy is striking, you can see he's landing on the center of his foot rather than landing heel first. And you can see the same thing here, right in there. And that's kind of the idea. It's like we've over padded our shoes, and has led to these improper postures. So we want to tell our clients to take their shoes off, because we want to see how they can move with their feet in a neutral position. Have them raise their arms overhead with elbows fully extended. Now, this lady's doing like palms forward. You do not actually have to do that on the overhead squat, like the picture there. You can do a neutral, you can do hands in a neutral position. There's nothing wrong with doing that. In fact, I actually like to do hands in a neutral position, because when you have them in a neutral position, that's external rotation. And so it puts even more stress on the lat, because the lat wants to do internal rotation. So it when you go like that, actually puts a little bit more stress there. And so that's why you'll see a lot of people doing this sort of like palms facing in at each other. Both are fine, and a lot of people do it with a broomstick. A lot of people will, she's actually practicing the overhead squat with a barbell, but you can even do it with a broomstick in hand. If anybody in here gets a job at Equinox, Equinox will teach you their assessment that they kind of approve of in their gyms, and it will be the overhead squat, but with a broomstick in hand. So that's what we're looking for there. And then your upper arm should be in line with your ears. They should bisect your ears and stuff. So you can see she's got a really good alignment there. And then you're going to instruct your client to squat to a comfortable, controlled position. They do not have to break parallel. We just want to see them squat down naturally. And then you're going to have them repeat that movement anywhere from like 3 to 5 times. Here's what I'll tell you guys what I like to do. And this is something we're going to practice when we actually meet up next time and kind of flow our way through like an actual like fitness assessment. I like to make my client do it anywhere from 10 to 15 times. We don't need that much. NASM's not recommending to do that much because, you know, if this person really does have really bad postural distortions, 15 squats could, you know, lead to an injury eventually. Me personally, I like to do it if I don't see anything that's like really that wrong with it, because I kind of like my assessments to feel a little bit like a workout. So I'll have them do 15 squats from the front, then I'll have them turn to the side and do 15 more, and then I have them turn from the back and I have them do 15 more. So they do 3 sets of 15, which will feel a little bit like a workout. And that way, like they, you know, the next day when they're thinking of me, they're like, oh man, I'm a little sore today. Like that was a heck of a workout. And I'm like, that wasn't the workout. And I'm like, oh my God, this guy's hardcore. You know, that's something I kind of like to do, which I think is an effective tool, but we'll talk about that later. And like I said, from the observation views, you're going to do anterior, you're going to do lateral, and you're going to do posterior. So ideally, it should look like this, right? You can see she's in really good alignment here. Her ASIS is directly in line with the middle of her knee, which is directly in line with her second and third toe. A lot of times we think, you know, people will aim to keep their knees over their big toe, but that's actually slightly adducted at that point. So we actually want it right over the very center of the foot. That's toe 2 and 3, right in the middle there. Versus like what we're seeing here, which is sort of a foot turnout situation, right? Where there's the external rotation. Knees are bowing out in as well in this version, but generally what will happen with the feet turn out is you'll see them also kind of cave in. And so the knees caving in is where obviously from the ASIS, this comes at an inward angle, and then the knee is lining up very much inside compared to those toes, right? If we draw a line straight down, that's certainly not in alignment there. So that's the one we're going to pay attention to today, which is why I actually have those muscles kind of listed out here. Now, I will say I put in the list of muscles that are actually in the corrective exercise table, which over here you'll notice that, like, you know, we see soleus, lateral side of the gastrocnemius, right? So the outside part of the gastrocnemius, and then the biceps femoris short head. You'll also notice that I've got the TFL listed here. So if you look at the CES table, they add that muscle in there. They add that TFL, which makes sense because remember that TFL is an internal rotator, right? So it is literally internally rotating the hip, which on the regular list doesn't show up until we address the knees caving inward. So it would have been listed anyways, but that's just where, you know, we just get a little bit more advanced about things. The table just gets a little bit bigger in the corrective exercise. So we got to move to the opposite muscles, right? What muscles to strengthen? That's going to be the opposite of the soleus and the gastrocnemius. You know, that's going to be your anterior tibialis muscles, right? So flipping to the other side of the joint would be like looking at, like, you know, pulling the foot into dorsiflexion. But also we see the opposite of the lateral side of the gastrocnemius is the medial side of the gastrocnemius, right? So like when we look at those calves, we've got 2 sets of fibers here. The lateral side, right, contracts to externally rotate the foot. If we want to get the foot to internally rotate, we need to pull it back the other way using the medial side. So we would actually do some calf raises, but with our toes pointed inward instead of pointed outward, which is sort of the problem that we're already having. How often do you guys see that in the gym? I see it all the time. People doing like freaking calf presses, and they're doing it. They do the 3 angles. They go like here, and then they go here, and then like sometimes they'll go here, but usually people skip that last one. Like it's a lot of people doing this and this, and I'm like, it's literally the opposite of what we're going for. So then we see the medial hamstring as well. So the medial hamstring, you get 2 sets of fibers on the hamstring. Same exact concept. Your hamstrings and your calves look really similar in terms of like their overall arrangement. But you can see like here's the lateral side goes to the outside, and the medial side goes to the inside and stuff. And so we're definitely seeing like this biceps femoris short head. Well, there's the overall biceps femoris, and there's the short head. So that's the lateral hamstring. Therefore, we need to strengthen the medial hamstring. And that's what we're seeing on that list here. The glutes, gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, those are the muscles that actually abduct. Now, those muscles are opposite of your TFL. So your tensor fasciae latae is this little muscle right here. Actually, that's a great picture right there. It's this short little hip muscle, right? Goes here to here. So when that pulls, that internally rotates the hip, and it also acts as a hip flexor. I mean, it's, make no mistake, it's also a hip flexor, but it does internally rotate the hip. So your gluteus maximus and your gluteus medius, they're in charge of external hip rotation. There's a picture. No. So those 2 muscles, your 2, kind of primary butt muscles here, they're in charge of external hip rotation, right? Like it grabs the other side of your femur here, right? So this glute muscle grabs the back. The TFL would come over to the front. It would grab here. So this one grabs here, this one grabs here, and that's why they do internal versus external rotation. We have not enough external rotation, so we're going to strengthen those 2 muscles there. Then we're going to see the gracilis. The gracilis is this little stabilizer muscle. Apparently there's a tree called the gracilis. But that one's running down here, again, rotating the thigh inward instead of stabilizing the way it's supposed to. And then we see the popliteus, which is this little itty bitty muscle that is also running along the back. Just a little tiny like knee stabilizer there. So gracilis needs to be strengthened, popliteus needs to be strengthened so that we can get better stability around the knee joint, and that will keep that excessive rotation from happening. Then in the knees caving in action, right? We're seeing the adductor complex is a little bit overactive, right? Adductors are kind of pulling inward. I get a picture of this. Yeah, some pictures. I want one with arrows, but I'm not getting it. So, well, there we go. That'll kind of work. So you can see here the muscles that are kind of pulling the knees inwards, right? It's these adductor muscles, this complex of muscles that actually brings the thigh inward, right? So that's overactive, and which makes a lot of sense considering that, like, obviously the knees are being pulled this way. So with the cave in, the adductor complex, we're also going to see the biceps femoris short head. Remember, that's that lateral hamstring muscle, right? From earlier. That one sometimes doesn't, that one's sometimes confusing. Why would a muscle on the outside of the thigh be causing the knees to cave in, right? Like, why would it be this little hamstring muscle right here that's pulling our knees inward? Well, it's not so much the adduction that the biceps femoris is contributing to, it's the internal rotation. So when we see the knees cave in, right, that's not just the knee like straight up coming in, it's actually rotating the femur. Try to find. There we go. This is the picture I was looking for earlier. So we can see, right, there's the adduction part, but there's also the internal hip rotation, right? And then there's also the external tibial rotation, right? So this comes this way, so then this one has to go this way, which brings this one back this way, right? So the biceps femoris short head does the tibial external rotation. Remember, I had you place your hand on the back of your thigh and twist your foot outwards. You'll feel that hamstring contract. So that's why that's overactive and tight. TFL again, that's that tensor fasciae latae up here doing the hip internal rotation. We also see vastus lateralis. This is listed in the corrective exercise book. It's not going to be listed in your regular book. Again, I want you guys to only, oh, actually, I guess it is on the regular book. Yeah, so get that one memorized. My apologies. So the vastus lateralis, that is a quadriceps muscle on the outside. Again, it works with the TFL. Works with the TFL, works with the biceps femoris, works with all those freaking lateral muscles there. It's this section of your quadriceps there. So all of that shares like a lot of like fascia. I'm find a good picture of that all together. Not real, kind of, yeah. So you can kind of see all the fascia that's kind of wrapping that all together, right? You can see there's like your fat tensor, tensor fascia latae is this section right here. Then your IT band, and then like your vastus lateralis, kind of going, your biceps femoris short head, all that like tight fascia, that's all sort of working together again to get really tight on the outside of the knee. That's why the vastus lateralis is on this list. So every now and then we'll see that tight quadriceps muscle on the outside of the thigh, the lateral quad muscle is actually contributing to that internal hip rotation and external tibial rotation. And then there's that frickin' lateral gastrocnemius again, down here, that tight calf muscle in the back, externally rotating the tibia there. So all that's kind of contributing to the knees caving in. Knees, underactive muscles that we need to strengthen in the opposite direction, right? Again, gluteus medius is going to abduct, right? The gluteus maximus is going to externally rotate. The vastus medialis oblique is a quadriceps muscle. That's the inside quadriceps muscle. We call that the VMO, or the vastus medialis. There's a great picture, by the way, of the two of those quad muscles, right? There's the VMO on the inside, there's the vastus lateralis on the outside, and there's all that freaking fascia I talked about. So this muscle is basically being deactivated. This is where you're trying to work on the teardrop, basically. Arnold Schwarzenegger famously was really good about carving out his VMO. Yeah, there we go. That is a substantial freaking VMO there. Huge sort of teardrop muscle there, right? There's another really good one.
You know who else had a really good one?
Who's that?
Batista.
Oh, I could see that. Yeah, I believe that. Again, kicker, soccer players have a great VMO. Yeah, absolutely. And then we see underactive muscles in the medial hamstring and the medial gastrocnemius. So again, we're trying to strengthen the inner portion of the hamstring instead of the outer portion of the hamstring, the inner portion of the calves instead of the outer portion of the calves. So that's going to fix all that caving in action. How are we following along so far, guys? Everybody feel pretty good about that? Those posture muscles making sense?
Yeah.
Cool. Joseph, Edwin, how you guys keeping up? I know it's like a lot of terminology, a lot of names of muscles that we haven't really in detail looked at so far.
I'm hanging in there.
Love that. Yeah, it'll feel like that for a while. It's like I'm hanging in. It gets better and better over time.
Yeah, just trying to absorb it.
Yeah. That's how everybody feels when they're studying kinesiology. All right, so the opposite of this is the knees caving out, right? That bow-legged posture, right? I like to call it the John Wayne. My parents loved watching Westerns. I said loved. My parents love, present tense, watching Westerns. I always call it the John Wayne posture. You see those people who like squat with the knees caving out. They do too much of that. Like they're on the inverted part of their foot. It's like John Wayne getting off a horse and he'd walk around, doing this kind of thing. That is our sort of bow-legged posture there. And so we don't see a picture of that here in the PowerPoint, but if we see knees cave out. Oh, come on. It's just not as common of a problem. So we just don't see enough of friggin' pictures of it. So there's the knees caving out, right? You can see she's putting all the weight on the outside of her foot. She's got a big excessive arch there, too much of an arched foot. And so it's, knees coming way out, probably line up like just outside the pinky toe there. Again, like I said, it's just not as common. We don't see it as often, but it means exactly the opposite of what we talked about with the knees cave in, right? Our overactive muscles. This time, we're going to see the piriformis is one of our overactive muscles. Now, your piriformis, and by the way, anybody who's ever had bow-legged posture, they'll tell you that it'll feel like they have sciatica. They'll get shooting leg pain. And your piriformis is this little tiny short muscle right here. It lives underneath your gluteus maximus. So it's actually right in here. Whenever you see someone like foam rolling their glutes, whenever you see somebody doing this thing here, where they get the one leg up like that, the reason they're doing that is because they're not trying to turn their glute muscles off. We want our glute muscles freaking turned on, What they're trying to do is they're trying to get to their sacrum there with this piriformis muscle, right? The asymmetric weight shift. This is a very tight muscle on the side that's pulling, towards their shift. So there's the piriformis, right? This tight glute muscle that's actually causing this kind of caving out action. Then we're going to see the biceps femoris. And you'll notice it doesn't say biceps femoris short head. It just says biceps femoris. That is the full lateral hamstring muscle. So a lot of times we'll have very tight hamstrings on clients like this as well. TFL is really tight here. That one confuses people, and I still have kind of a hard time remembering that that's on the list here because the TFL causes internal rotation. So why is that a problem when someone is knees caving out? Well, it's related to the hip flexion action of it. It's where the hip, this is also a hip flexor. It does internal rotation and hip flexion. And so that's a very tight muscle that's kind of causing that caving action to occur by pulling the femur upwards, not internally rotating it. So that's the one that I'm like, wait, it's overactive on opposite problems. That doesn't make any sense. And it's because that muscle has two jobs, which is also why it's very commonly overactive. And then the only freaking time you are going to see glute muscles listed on our overactive list. It's going to be your gluteus minimus, which shares fascia with that TFL. So the minimus is on this inside ridge, right? There's the piriformis coming across. There's the gluteus minimus coming across. The TFL will be starting, over here and it'd be running over to here. And then the IT band would become the rest of that fascia there. So very, very weird to have a glute muscle that's tight. But again, that's where, we are going to see a lot of people doing that foam rolling on the glute there, right? They're going to be working on, getting that SMR right into that ridge of the pelvis. And then we see the gluteus medius as well, right? That bigger one that kind of lays over top of the gluteus minimus. It's our lateral muscle. Again, we've got too much abduction here and not enough adduction. So we need to work on that. You'll sometimes see basketball players with knees caving out sometimes, especially the ones who are doing like a lot of like side shuffling. Like the more you kind of practice that sort of side shuffle move where you're here, you know, that is oftentimes what causes that sort of bow-legged posture sometimes. Unless you are the type of like lateral movement where you're doing this kind of thing, where you can see my knees are caving in, you'll still see people do that as well. Those are the people with the really tight, like short head. And then our underactive muscles, we need to strengthen the adductors. So we need to do things where we're squeezing the thighs inward. We need to strengthen the medial hamstring. So we need that, you know, that's where honestly the floor bridge is like the perfect exercise for a client with knees caving out. But floor bridge with adduction. A lot of times you see people do the floor bridge with the abduction. They'll do the, you know, you'll see this in the gym all the time where they're doing, oh God, yeah, you'll sometimes see this. This is terrible for a knees cave out client. This is great for a knees cave in client, but horrible for a knees cave out client. That's a clamshell floor bridge. You'll see people do it with the bands, right? And what that does, they have to push on the bands to abduct. Terrible if your knees cave out. Great if your knees cave in. In fact, we're going to see that one, I think, in the routine that I wrote later. But when you see the adduction, the knees squeezing, you know, the Pilates ring or like, you know, yoga block squeeze, that's a great way to activate the medial portion of your hamstring. However, this freaking knees cave out thing that this guy is doing, don't do that. Like, that's bad. That's a bad example right there. Ideally, you want the feet in a neutral position, kind of like this, as you're squeezing. So, you know, honestly, again, it's just, we're just doing the opposite, right? And then we see the gluteus maximus as underactive. You know, that's underactive on everything. Now, I did mention earlier how a lot of times we just flip to the opposite muscles. You know, a lot of times it's like hip flexors tight, strengthen the glute. You know, hamstring is tight, strengthen, you know, we just flip to the other side of the joint. It's not always the opposite muscle that is the problem muscle. Sometimes it's also a synergist muscle. Sometimes you'll get what's called synergistic dominance, where a helper muscle will do too much work. With a client whose knees are caving out, that is where like the medial glute and the minimal glute and the piriformis, they're all synergistic. They're supposed to work with your gluteus maximus, but they're doing too much work. They're basically doing, you know, it's like Robin taking over for Batman is how I like to think about it. It's where your synergist is inhibiting your agonist because it's doing way too much. So yeah, there are more. We got the low back arch, like I said. We got the low back rounding, which is the backwards posterior tilt. We got the arms falling forward. We got the foot flattening, heel rise, and asymmetric shift. We will cover these in the next coming days. I know it seems, you know, there's just too much to do with the overhead squat in one day, so we're going to come back to that. So moving forward past the overhead squat, let's talk a little bit about the single leg squat. I love these two slides because they're so well lined up. But let's talk about the single leg squat assessment. So let's say you have somebody do the overhead squat and they absolutely crush it. Like they do it and it looks perfect alignment, right? Now I'm not necessarily like digging for something wrong. I don't want something to be wrong with my client's posture, but I do want to know how they move. And if I didn't observe it, I couldn't find it during the overhead squat, this is where the single leg squat comes in really handy. So the single leg squat is designed to assess for mobility as well, but it's also going to assess your client's balance. So it's designed to assess your ankle proprioception, your ankle's ability to kind of know what's going on and whether or not it's got enough like, you know, connection to everything, your core strength, which has a lot to do with your balance as well, And then hip joint stability. So yes, like obviously there is some posture here as well. So instruct your client to stand with their hands on their hips, focusing on an object straight ahead. Foot and ankle should be in a neutral position from the start. And then their pelvis should be in a neutral position as well. I know I'm not mentioning that too much here, but that should be like completely normal. Oh, it does say it. I may have put that here. Actually, no, it's in the PowerPoint. Yeah, and the knee and the lumbopelvic hip complex should also be in a neutral position. A lot of times, guys, you'll see somebody like go into the single leg and they'll shift over to one side, like just right from the get-go. Or they'll raise one hip, right? They'll like hike up their hip like that. That is not where we want to start someone. If you see that like right from the start, it's like, okay, like we're gonna see some posture problems here. So ideally, you're gonna have them squat to a comfortable height as if they are sitting back into a chair. So instruct them to raise one leg and accept their weight on the opposite leg. Foot should be lifted right next to it. It doesn't have to be this isn't a pistol squat. You know, the leg's not forward. The leg is just kind of resting right next to the other one, you know, just a couple inches off the ground. And then you're going to have them squat to a comfortable position, 3 to 5 reps per side. I usually like to do, 2 rounds of that. And you're only looking from the anterior view. You're not going to look from the lateral view. You're not going to look from the front because we are only paying attention to the hip and the knees here. So when we are looking at it in your regular textbook, there's really only one thing to pay attention to, and that is whether or not the knee caves in. Now, there's going to be a whole big list of things to look for in corrective exercise. You're going to look for all kinds of stuff. Here is, wow, that's pixelated. Here is like trunk rotation, internally or externally. We see hip hiking in laterally or medially, but you'll look at those later. For now, guys, I just want you to worry. Oh, and then you'll see knees cave in and knees cave out. So hip hike, hip drop, rotation, internal, a forward rotation, backwards rotation. But in the regular textbook, the only thing you're looking at is the knees cave in. And if the knees cave in, it actually means exactly the same thing as it did in the overhead squat. Tight adductors, pulling the knee inward. Tight biceps femoris short head, externally rotating the tibia. Tight TFL, internally rotating the hip. Vastus lateralis, that's that quad muscle that's sharing with the biceps femoris, externally rotating the tibia / internally rotating the hip. And then lateral gastrocnemius, externally rotating the ankle. Underactive muscles, flip it to the other side, right? Instead of the adductors, the gluteus. Instead of the TFL, instead of the adductors, it's the glute medius. Instead of the TFL, it's the glute maximus. Instead of the vastus lateralis, it's the vastus medialis. Instead of the biceps femoris, which is the lateral hamstring, it's the medial hamstring. Instead of the lateral gastrocnemius, it's the medial gastrocnemius. So again, lots of opposites there, but there's also a lot of synergistic action happening here. Like those quadricep muscles are not antagonists. They're synergists. Those hamstring muscles are synergists. There's just that one side's pulling more than it's supposed to. So questions, comments, concerns. How do we feel about our working list today, which is just the knees cave out, just the knees cave in, feet turn out?
Good. I'm good.
Cool. All right. So Joseph and Edwin, this is the first time you guys have seen sort of like how we write out our programs here. So this is available on NASM's website. It looks a little bit different. That's my sort of modified version. You can go to NASM and get what's called their OPT template, which is sort of what we use to write our workouts, So it looks kind of like this, right? Client's name, their goal, what their warm-up muscles are. So this is what that kind of kind of looks like here if we zoom in, right? So under the warm-up section, that is where I am. So professional name, like let's say, like if this was me, I'd say client name. We'll use Dion as an example, just because we know this is what we're working on, right? And so we see the feet turning out and the knees caving in. Now, if I've got him starting in phase 1, we're going to start in what we call the stabilization level, which is going to be a lot of exercises that are really focused on fixing posture imbalances and addressing the right muscles at the right time. So we are going to start by SMRing the calves, hamstrings, TFL, and adductors. We look at my list from earlier, right? And we go up to the knees caving in. These are all of our overactive muscles, right? We saw it was the lateral gastrocnemius, right? TFL, Adductor Complex, and then I have it listed as hamstring. Now, on the coaching tips, I'd probably be a little bit more explanatory about this. I would say for hamstrings, put pressure on lateral side. For calves, put pressure on lateral side. Right? So for both of those, I'm focused on the lateral gastrocnemius and I'm focused on the lateral biceps femoris. Now in your textbook, you'll see a demo that looks like this. You'll see a lot of pictures that are just somebody getting on a foam roller and they're taking it kind of just behind the back of the knee there, just above the actual knee itself and kind of rolling. Now, what I would do if I was trying to get the lateral side is I would just externally rotate my hip. You can see he did that right there, right? To kind of expose that outside biceps femoris. Personally, I don't think foam rollers work very well on the hamstrings. I just think it's too big of a surface area. Like that's a big circle there with a lot of surface area. Personally, I really like what's called the pin and stretch method of your biceps femoris. I like to use a lacrosse ball and I like to do it from a seated position like this. So I got a little video to show you guys. This is what we call this guy Brent Brookbush. He started this thing called the Brookbush Institute. This guy's a freaking genius. He used to work with NASM, and he's really going to do a really great job of kind of showing you how to do this. So here's a little video that's kind of explain how to really use the pin and stretch.
This is part of the Brookbush Institute. In this video, we're going over advanced self-administered release techniques, specifically biceps femoris, dynamic release, or pin and stretch. I'm going to have my friend Melissa come out. I'm going to kind of explain the setup. This is a bit of a tricky setup. If you guys have ever tried to do release techniques for the hamstrings sitting on the floor with your legs stretched out in front of you, you might have noticed it doesn't work very well. It's very hard to find any sort of tender point. It doesn't really seem to help extensibility all that much. If you get on a platform that you can sit on with your legs dangling, it actually makes things a lot easier because now we have a relaxed biceps femoris and we can use the weight of your leg to create pressure rather than trying to sit up on the floor, which might even activate the biceps femoris and make a release very hard to get. The next thing we have to figure out is, you may have noticed that a foam roll doesn't work very well, that as soon as you put pressure with a foam roll, you just kind of flop either hamstring to either side of the femur, and it's really hard to get any sort of specific pressure. So we need a little smaller surface area so that we get more pressure per square inch. Now last, for this particular technique, is we need a smaller surface area to pin down the adhesive tissue in my biceps femoris, but I still need to maintain my perpendicular width so that I can block the adhesion as I'm going to have her move through this particular technique. That's where these massage therapy balls come in. They're very handy. They're foam 5-inch balls. I suppose you could use a medicine ball if you could find the right size ball, but for convenience, these trigger point balls are real nice. I'm gonna have Melissa go ahead and she's gonna look for a tender point between her knee and her ischium on the outside of her thigh there. Just look for the most tender point. You can roll back and forth, kind of scoot on your butt, or you can move the ball as she is, or a combination of the two. When she finds an adhesive point, I'm now going to...
I love that moment, by the way. You can see her face where she found it and she goes, mm-hmm. And then like she presses a little harder and she goes, you can see like where she really like hit a tender spot.
Point. I'm now going to ask her to move just distal to it. That's closer to her knee. So she's going to move just like this. If this is the ball, this is the adhesion, right? We're going to move just off it, because what I want her to do with that ball is block the adhesive tissue. Because now I'm going to ask her to do the fun part. I'm going to ask her to extend her knee, which is going to lengthen my biceps femoris and pull those muscle fibers through the adhesive tissue, which we hope helps her extensibility. So she's going to block, extend her knee, hold for 2 to 5 seconds, and then back down. If somebody doesn't have this much extensibility, you could have them put their hands behind them and lean back a little bit, right? So we'll lengthen out the biceps femoris by extending at the hip a little bit. Hold. She's going to do 10 to 15 repetitions for 2 to 5 with 2 to 5 second holds at the end. The same sort of protocol you'd use for active stretching. If I needed her to do both sides, I could have her do 15 and 15, and then
So what's really great about this is like by dragging that muscle, you know, she's contracting her quadriceps here. Remember, that's the reciprocal inhibition we talked about earlier. So she's getting the benefits of active isolated stretching while she's also pressing into that tight muscle, which is creating autogenic inhibition, which we've talked about in other classes, where it's where you put pressure on the sensor receptor and the sensor receptor goes, wow, there's a lot of tightness here. Safest course of action, relax the muscle. And so she is actively trying to relax her biceps femoris, and she's actively trying to contract her quadriceps. And that's why I find this is a very, very, very effective SMR technique for a tight biceps femoris short head. If I got a client whose knees cave in, or a client whose feet turn out, or a client with low back rounding, actually, this is one of my favorite techniques.
we're going to move on. As far as where this fits in our program, realize that these are progressions from static release techniques. I would like to start by toning down what overactivity she has in her biceps femoris, and probably a more effective way to do that is with those static trigger point releases. We need to make sure that we're using these techniques specific to improving movement. So I don't want anybody chasing pain just because their hamstrings hurt or because they feel like their hamstrings are tight. Remember that feelings aren't facts. We need to go back to our movement assessment. If I'm using this technique, I'm thinking somebody's feet turn out, their knees bow in or their knees bow out. They have an inadequate forward lean or a posterior pelvic tilt on their overhead squat assessment. So those are those 5 signs. If I was looking at goniometry, I'd be looking at maybe my knee extension with hip flexed goniometry assessment, internal or external rotation of the hip, internal rotation being more, or a limit in internal rotation being more indicative of biceps femoris tightness. Muscle length tests, of course, we could do the hamstring length test if we were looking specifically for hamstring length. Big overarching concept there, guys, is this would be based on a movement assessment, and it would follow doing probably 2 to 6 weeks of static release techniques for the same muscle before I used this progression in some sort of home exercise program, integrated warm-up, movement prep sort of situation. So there you guys go. You're going to look for the most tender spot on the lateral back of the thigh, all right, the lateral portion of the posterior thigh. Once you find that adhesive point, You're going to go just distal to that point. Make sure that that adhesive tissue is now blocked behind this trigger point massage therapy ball. You're then going to extend the knee to pull that biceps femoris through that adhesive tissue for 10 to 15 repetitions with 2 to 5 second holds. I hope you guys get great results. I look forward to hearing about your outcomes.
So if you guys ever get a chance, find this channel, subscribe to it. This guy is a freaking genius. He also does continuing education stuff, which is pretty great. Great physical therapist out there. One of my favorites. So that is an advanced SMR technique for the hamstrings, right? And by the way, you can do pin and stretches on your calf muscles as well, right? So if we did SMR on the calves, right? You could literally just place that foam roller there. And then you can actually, she's doing it in this picture here, flex and extend the ankle, right? So we can draw the toes back and then we can draw the toes forward. We can draw the toes back, draw the toes forward. And that will also sort of pin and stretch as she's sort of rolling through this whole range of motion here. So that is that. And then the TFL, it's another really big one. Remember, that's a hip internal rotator. So basically what you're going to do is you are going to place the foam roller or lacrosse ball or whatever tool you're using just below the ASIS, so below that little hip bone and just above that knob on the trochanter of the femur over here. So basically, guys, place it right on your pocket. Most shorts, like, it'll be perfect. You place it, you put that foam roller right, you put your pocket right on the roller. It's like practically the perfect spot every time. So calves, hamstrings, TFL, and then the adductors, that inner thigh, right? Now on this one, you want to be a little cautious. Obviously, we are doing the inner thigh here. So gentlemen, be cautious about where you're rolling. You don't want to pinch any sensitive anatomy. But you basically set the roller up sort of perpendicular to your thigh there, and you kind of roll side to side. He's kind of focused on this lower portion here. You can get in up closer into the groin as well. Just depends on which part of your adductors are tight. You know, there's a lot of surface, there's a lot of length to the adductors. And so everybody's going to be a little bit different there. I tend to find that I'm really tight, kind of where this guy is right here. But I've known other people who, you know, it's really much more up into the groin and stuff. But again, you can use lacrosse ball as well. But that's the area that we're getting into there, again, if the knees are caving in. So once we foam roll those things, we're basically working our way through this sort of 4-step process here. We call it the corrective exercise continuum, where we're going to start by inhibiting, trying to turn off any of our overactive muscles, right? So inhibition is, you know, relieving tension by using massage techniques, massage guns, foam rollers, lacrosse balls, all of that self-myofascial release stuff, you know. And you can do manual myofascial release too if you're certified in it, or if you've got, you know, the tools and you're allowed to and stuff. You can always do massage as well, manual release techniques. But in here, we're just talking about regular old inhibition. You can just guide your client through it with SMR. And so inhibit that tension through self-myofascial release techniques. Now, since we've gotten through that, the next thing we're going to move into, you'll notice that I've got all these specific stretches listed out, right? A little bit of a static calf stretch, a little bit of a static biceps femoris, TFL, and adductor stretch here. So these are all stretches for the same muscles, and I've got them as static stretches. So that's the lengthening section. So we inhibit first, we lengthen second. We lengthen the muscles through static stretching, or we could also do neuromuscular stretching. That's the PNF technique that you're going to learn in capstone, where you stretch and then you actually contract and then you stretch further. It kind of shuts down your nervous system. Sort of puts together like the autogenic and the reciprocal, similar to the pin and stretch. But that's the lengthening technique. We're going to stretch out afterwards, you know, and lengthen any of those muscles. So because my client is in the stabilization phase, level 1, I'm going to do static stretches in particular here. So I'm going to do a static wall calf stretch, which is more commonly referred to as like the runner's stretch. But that's this one right here, right? Now I would make sure that I'm paying special attention. I'd put that in the coaching tips probably. Pay attention. Well, keep foot in neutral or slightly internal posture. Doesn't fit. So I would probably leave that note in there. I'd say, like, look, I want your foot to be neutral because their foot's going to want to naturally turn out if that lateral gastric nemus is tight, right? It'll want to do that foot turn out thing. So I will put effort into making sure that it's, nice and neutral there. Then I'm going to do a static biceps femoris stretch, which is this one right here. It's kind of a unique looking stretch, but basically you're going to elevate. So now I'm already stretching the hamstrings a little bit, but as she hinges forward, she's also going to rotate in the opposite direction as she sort of brings that chest forward. And again, that's creating, remember this foot, this does external tibial rotation. So by doing this, we are doing internal tibial rotation. That's why that is stretching that out so much. So that's definitely, more of an extended position there. You could also do this laying on the ground. Just don't do it with your foot pointed like this. You'd want to keep your toe flexed back towards you. But again, you can see that internal tibial rotation, which is the opposite of the external tibial rotation. You could also do this version here.
Muchas gracias. Adiós.
Ads. So we would go back and then across the body, across the midline. That's also a really good TFL IT band stretch, by the way. And then we've got a standing TFL stretch, which is going to look like this. So the TFL, it does hip flexion, right? So she is drawing this leg into hip extension. It does internal rotation. So what is she doing? She is externally rotating the foot, and then she's leaning away slightly, creating even further external rotation. So that's a pretty good stretch for the TFL. There's other ones out there. You'll see people do this standing one sometimes, where they'll just cross the foot over the midline. So they're getting a good, sort of stretch there. It's not bad. Personally, I like that standing one. I think it's a little bit more dynamic. Then we're going to do the static standing adductor stretch. So we're going to follow that up here where our clients, she does a pretty gentle one, but that is not the deepest stretch in the world, but like, yes, you're going to get into that inner thigh there. Take a nice big stance. Make sure your knee is still in alignment there. Keep this leg straight and keep your toe pointing forward. Don't let it rotate while you're doing that stretch. And then finally, we are going to throw our client onto the elliptical. So that right there is going to loosen up all of those muscles that are turning my feet out and caving my knees in, right? Now that's half the equation. We have gone through the inhibition, we've gone through the lengthening. Now we need to look at the activating. So we need to turn on our underactive muscles. And the underactive muscles are going to be turned on when I do specific strengthening movements that target them in particular. So remember, our underactive muscles for the knees caving in and the feet turning out are the gluteus medius and gluteus maximus, the VMO, medial hamstring, and medial gastric nemus, and then our knee stabilizers as well. So the floor bridge is a perfect exercise for this because this is a really good opportunity for me to strengthen my gluteus maximus. by driving that through like a full range of motion. So I bring it up, I bring it down. Also, I can keep my feet in a neutral position, or I could even slightly internally rotate in order to activate more of my medial hamstring. Now, here's the thing. I like this movement, but I think what would work really well here would also be like a clamshell floor bridge, which is that variation we saw earlier with the client who, I guess we'll just use this one. Nope, hold on. So this version here with the knees caved in, right? That's a really good external rotation there. So that's getting a little bit less of the gluteus maximus, and a little bit more of the gluteus medius in this version. And then she's even got a band around her thighs, which is putting even more pressure on those abductor muscles. So that wouldn't be a bad one. Or we could do a floor bridge with abduction. We could also keep it in a neutral position and just use a band there. You know, that would also be a good one. You can go above the thighs, you can go below the thighs. There's really no, you know, perfect version of that. They both work just as well. Oh, that's more of a hip. That's not the same. So I would say like floor bridge, and I'd be like with band abduction would be a good variation if we wanted to do that. We've also got the modified side iso abs with hip abduction. I know that's a really long name, but that is what it's called in your textbook. And that is where you are going to do basically a modified side plank. So your knee is down, not a full-on side plank. And then you are going to raise that opposite leg and strengthen that gluteus medius. So she's squeezing her glute and abducting, right? And what's kind of cool about this is she's actually abducting on both sides, right? She's getting a little bit of stability abduction on that lower leg, and then this upper leg is actually actively contracting. So she's really getting twice the amount of work. And you could do a full-on side plank here as well. You don't have to do just the modified side plank. Like there's the modified, but you can also do like the full thing, right? And now I will say she is doing this with like, you know, she's not doing it. She's doing it with her hand up. That makes it even harder. You can also grab your shoulder across with the other arm. That can add some stability and make it a little easier. But that's the modified side iso abs or side plank with hip abduction. Then we got the single leg balance with reach is another really good one. Now this is a balance exercise. So moving outside of just like direct strengthening movement, those are really like for our core, right? You can see we call this the core balance reactive section. Floor bridge is for your core. Modified side iso abs is very much for your core. But the single leg balance with reach is a really good example of a balance exercise that's going to strengthen those knee stabilizers. So he's standing on one leg, and he's going in all three planes of motion, right? So he goes sagittal, frontal, and that's still very sagittal. Hold on a second. Sagittal, frontal, and then she should do a swing with her foot. There we go. That little swing right there, that's the transverse. And so now the gracilis, the popliteus, those knee stabilizers that we want to strengthen, right? You can even see she's doing a little bit of wobbly, right? She's losing a little bit. That's what we're going for. We're looking for all those knee stabilizers to get nice and active and help with that sort of stabilization. And then the same thing is true of the squat jump to stabilization, right? This is a reactive exercise, and she's going to jump and then land. We're going to pay very special close attention to making sure the knees are not allowed to cave in, and we're keeping the feet in a neutral position. So jump and stabilize, stabilize, stabilize. So that's really good for strengthening the glutes, and it's really good for working on those knee stabilizers as we move through this full range of motion. So now we've activated all of our underactive muscles. Now all we can do is move into the main sort of meat and potatoes of our workout here. which would be where we get into like the resistance section, right? Like this is where we're really going to like build our workout. Maybe it's, you know, it's a total body workout. So we got like a barbell squat in there, and then we have like a deadlift, and then we pair that up with like a bench press and then a bent over row, right? We're hitting some regular old movements, right? That's not bad. That's a pretty good workout. That's the integrated portion where it's like, you know, we are using total body exercises to really like solidify everything. Deadlift's a great example of that. But I could make it even more complicated. I could do like a step up to balance with overhead press. That's a true full body movement, right? Biceps, triceps, and shoulders, plus also the stepping up portion, which is glutes, hamstrings, quads, and calf muscles, right? And that's where we get into the integrated part, but we don't necessarily always have to do that. That is, you know, we can always address this as like, look, this is what I want you to do in the morning, you know, and then when we come to the gym, we'll do a different, you know, we'll do a different workout and stuff. But for this is like your morning warm up every day. Start your day like this, or before you go to bed. Do this before you go to bed to get those muscles turned on and turned off, you know. And then our cool down, we just did the exact same thing. We just kind of flipped it. We started with the elliptical, then we went with static stretches at the end. I actually don't know why I don't have the foam rolling in here. That's interesting. There we go. So there's sort of we elliptical first, foam roll, and then stretch all those same muscles there. And that's a program that's going to address that. Dion, I would say this program right here, you're going to get in your email today. I'd start practicing this. This would be your warm up every time you go to the gym.
Okay, please send it to me.
Yeah. The only thing, add in that one ankle stretch I showed you. Get the soleus loosened up as well.
Yeah, I've been doing it actually.
Love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, and that is sort of the overhead squat in a nutshell. Any questions, guys? How are we feeling today? Comments, concerns? Anybody? Love it. All right, I have one little bonus video to show you. This is actually a little bit more related to finding your squat stance. Uh-oh, there are way too many of these videos. Which one is the one I'm thinking of? There we go. Okay, here's a fun little video that's going to kind of break this down for you. This one's all about like looking at the natural shape of your femur in order to understand that rotation. So we'll knock this out, and then that'll be sort of, this is sort of a bonus. You're not gonna be tested on anything like this, but I find it is super helpful for people who are getting more serious about their squat. And look, you can see very different here, right? She's a little more narrow, he's a little wider. He's got like major wide and major rotation. So great video. This is Squat University. This is another one. Brent Brookbush, and then this guy's name is Aaron Horshig. Those are the guys. So follow them.
In today's video, I'm going to show you how your anatomy can change your squat stance.
Get up and get down, get up and get.
Hey guys, thanks so much for stopping by Squat University. In today's video, I'm going to show you how your anatomy, specifically your hip anatomy, can change your squat stance from being 100% straight forward or extremely toed out. All right, so here's the first thing. We have to do a little anatomy lesson. Now, the way in which most people, so we'll call textbook anatomy of your hips, your femur connects to your pelvis at a slight angle forward. However, some people don't have that textbook anatomy alignment of their femur. Their hips may be more angled forward, which is called anteversion, or their hips may be naturally more flat in their connection, which is called retroversion. And depending on the anatomy variation you have, it can have a dramatic effect on what feels most natural for you to squat, which is then going to change how well you move and how much weight you can lift, because you want to find the squat stance that's most optimal for your body. Now today let's talk about how to screen for the difference between anteversion and retroversion, something that you can do at home. You don't have to go see a medical professional to do this screen, okay? So I'm gonna have Christine come on over, and she is gonna start by sitting on the edge of the bench. Now all you have to do in this is look at the difference between internal rotation and external rotation. Now, someone with anteversion will have internal rotation excessive in two positions. So we have internal rotation and external. What you're gonna look for is it excessive in one position? So we have a lot.
By the way, really quickly, just so I can address this, if you're watching this and you might be a little confused as to why you keep saying, like when the foot's coming inward, that is external rotation. Yes, the foot is coming inward, but the femur, right, the thigh, is externally rotating in response. And then when we pull the foot this way, which is, towards the outside, that's actually internal. We're talking about the hip here. He should be saying like internal hip rotation versus external hip rotation. And that'd be a lot clearer for you guys. But if anybody was confused about that, that's right now, right? Her femur's rotating towards the midline. So this is internal rotation, even though it's external with the tibia. It's internal at the hip.
In one position. So we have a lot of internal rotation and we have very little external rotation. Now that's only one clue. Let's go over on your stomach. We have to also look at your body's ability to produce hip internal and external in a prone position lying on your stomach. In this position, she has, again, very limited external rotation and excessive internal rotation. If this is you and you have excessive internal rotation and limited external in seated and limited external and excessive internal also in a prone position or laying on your stomach, we can say it's because you have anteversion in your hips. So your pelvis is more aligned at an angle. What this means is that because your pelvis is more set forward in the angle, come over here, of the femur in which it articulates, it is natural for you to squat 100% usually straight forward. This is the way in which her body aligns the hips and everything most optimally. So if she were to try to squat with her toes turned out excessively, try to squat down, it's not going to feel very well. She's not going to get very deep in her squat. It can lead to a lot of knee issues and a lot of hip issues. It's not going to be suited for her anatomy. So understanding what her anatomy is allows us to find the most optimal position for her squat. Now, let's talk about the opposite end. Ed, come on over here. Again, we're going to look in two positions, seated and prone. So in this position, let's look at Ed's internal rotation. Not much. Let's look at his external rotation. A lot. So he's got very limited internal and very excessive external. Now, let's also look in prone, because remember, we have to look at both positions. So in this position, internal, very limited, external, excessive. So again, he fit the pattern that in both positions, seated and prone on his stomach, he had the same amount. He had very limited internal and very excessive external. What that means is that Ed fits the profile for someone who is retroverted in the way in which his femur aligns with his pelvis is very flat angle. What this means is that Ed, being very retroverted, naturally has a body that's built to have a little bit more of a toe out position, maybe 30 degrees, maybe even 35 degrees. So squat down. In this position, this is the way in which his body naturally moves most optimally. His body's aligned to produce the most force. His back is staying flat in this position. If he were to try to adopt a very straightforward foot position, he would actually close off his hip joint much sooner. Squat down. Obviously, you can see he can't squat any deeper. It limits his squat depth because being very externally rotated or being very internally rotated now, because he's retroverted, he's just smashing his femur into the front side of his pelvis. Basically, he's impinging on himself. So one of the reasons people develop hip impingements is because they are adopting a squat pattern that is not right for their anatomy. And actually by finding out, hey, I have a lot of retroversion to my hips, maybe opening up my toes a little bit to allow my femurs to move in their more ideal and optimal range can allow him to not only squat deeper, but have a better feeling squat and produce a little bit more power. So that is the difference between anteversion and retroversion. Now, here's the big thing to understand. If when doing the seated in the prone test, you didn't find that it was the exact same, so you maybe had excessive external rotation while seating, while in the seated pattern, but then when you went up and you laid on your stomach, it was different. It flipped sides. What that means is that your body probably doesn't have retroversion or anteversion. You lie within that textbook normal range. For those type of people, your natural position will likely be a slight toe out angle during your squat. It's not 100% straightforward. It's not extremely wide. It's going to be within that slight toe out position, maybe 7 to 12 to 15 degrees or so. That's what's going to give you the optimal alignment in your squat stance for you to move as well as possible and keep your body safe. So I hope you guys liked today's quick Squat University video on YouTube. If you have any questions about that test,
anyway,
let me
love this channel. Big fan of this channel. He has got some great ankle tips as well. You know, there's some really good ankle anatomy stuff that he does that's like really great. But anyway, that is a little bit of a bonus. You know, like I said, there are a lot of other postural assessments out there that are not just, you know, not just the ones that we find in our sort of NASM textbook. You guys are just dipping your toes in the water of posture analysis. But that will do it for today, guys. Let me kill the recording and then we can get you all out of here.